considered funerals a time to certainly mourn the dead. But it is also a time, is it not, to celebrate the life that they lived, the accomplishments of their friends and family they've experienced by enjoying their life with them. And I was quite touched, dear, by all these fine folks who came out to visit today. I wonder if they know much about our lives. Do you know of me, Jonathan Thompson, or my wife Elizabeth? Would you care to learn a little bit about our times and our life?
Yes.
Well, maybe we should start with the place that we are residing in right now. What do you call this place?
Cemetery.
Cemetery? What else might you call it?
Sagtikos Manor.
Yes, Sagtikos Manor. Have you heard the term graveyard?
Yes.
Okay. Well, we're going to ask Mr. Finnegan here to come forth and tell us a little bit about the history of graveyards and cemeteries of our time. The floor is yours, sir.
Welcome. The cemetery is a resting place, and generally it's not affiliated with any particular congregation. Similar to a family plot, it's not a particular faith and such. A graveyard or a churchyard is tied to a specific faith. So when we look at cemeteries, we go with the adage, ashes to ashes, dust to dust. So in my life, I was a member of the Islip militia in 1776. I knew Squire Thompson, who owned the house, and I knew the children. They were young, very young at the time. And I was involved with the militia, and we went to the Battle of Long Island. Now I'm a laborer and occasionally a grave digger. So this is my knowledge about cemeteries. So there were really those three types of cemeteries. The population of Islip in 1776 was approximately 370, the entire town of Islip. So as a result of that, if someone was deceased in your family, you would actually bury him wherever you wanted to. However, you generally buried them on your property, and or if you had a friend that had a family burial plot, you may ask them if they could appropriately bury them there. The markers they used, again, it was an economic and social issue. For instance, in this cemetery, you have all of these sedimentary rocks, brownstones, limestone, slate. There's no slate, but slate were the type of markers they were able to get. If you didn't have the wherewithal, like me as a laborer, I would use wooden crosses, wooden planks, field stones. You would pile field stones, or you'd plant a sapling there. That's where such and such is buried, and that tree is growing as a result of it. I need you, and can you help me out? So those are the cemeteries. You're going to hold this young man, and you're going to turn around. Okay, take your hands out of your pockets. Okay, put your arms up. There you go. You're going to hold that. Okay, I got very confused about this, but if you hold it up so that it's facing them, you can see this has 6 sides, and this is a coffin. This is 4 sides, equidistant and rectangular, and that is a casket. Coffin, casket. I always got them mixed up. This is 6-sided. It required a skilled tradesman to put it together, whereas this was more of an American. This is European, and probably everyone buried here is buried with this type of coffin. And this was a casket generally used in the Americas. So thank you very much. You can have a seat. You did a great job. Now this young man, because of finances, they would often take this coffin and you could rent it. Some people couldn't afford a coffin. So if you see at the top, to preserve the top, there was no lid at the top, and they would have a viewing section where you could see the person who's, oh, you can grab that, just okay. Hold on to it. And you could see the person buried in there and not affect the top lid. However, on the bottom, there's 2 options, the side and the bottom. So hold this way. So what would happen is there's a pivot here, and then when the ceremony was over, you would pour the person into the grave. Or, now put your 2 arms out, like that. Okay, like that, hold it. You're doing a good job. Step, that's it, that's good. You're good. So Or the other option is there would be a lid or a bottom trap door. And so you just saw the mourning ceremony, correct? And you had 2 horses that were holding the casket. So here, after the ceremony, they would just drop the door open and the body would fall into the grave. You did a great job. Thank you very, very much. So what does 6 foot under mean? Have you ever heard that term, 6 foot under? I know that guy, he's 6 foot under. What does that mean? He's dead, correct. But there was a practical explanation of that, and the practical explanation is, in London in 1656, the Lord Mayor of London was besieged by the plague, and there was deaths all out throughout the city. So he decreed to the population that anyone who died had to be buried immediately 6 foot in the ground. So they were buried there, and years later came in one. The population of London increased and increased. And so as a result of that, people passed away, and they were going to the grave and the churchyards. And the churchyards were overcrowded, so they hired people to disinter the bodies. And when they disinterred the bodies, they discovered, because they were buried immediately, that there were scratch marks on the lid. So that caused fear of being buried alive. And that was a palpable fear of being buried alive. I'm still frightened by the fact that they may be buried alive. So as a result of that, they established wakes, or awake. Wakes, not woke, wakes. And they had these wakes for 3 or 4 or 5 days. I thought it was because of the transportation issues at the time, horses, carriages, whatever, to get to different places where the wake was being held. But I'm wrong. The point of a wake was to have the deceased in your parlor, laying there, and what was the hope? What was the hope against hope that the family members and loved ones would have? They would wake up. And what did they do? Unfortunately, most of the time they didn't wake up. Although we had a young lady who indicated today that a relative of hers woke up when they were young. They were 4 years old, and awake they did wake up. Yes.
My family, when my grandmother was younger, they were laying out, I guess her aunt, and when somebody had bent down, they noticed their glasses fogged up. They were still breathing.
See, another example. 2 examples today. Thank you very much. So, so that's the wake. But if, in fact, they didn't wake up, there was still a concern about being buried alive, and so an entrepreneur came up with the idea of tying a string to the finger, and they'd be laid in the casket, and then the string would go up to the ground level, and there would be a bell on a pivot. And if the body woke up, the bell would go, and so therefore they would know to dig them up. But one of the problems is that you needed coverage to make sure that someone was available, and so at night in particular, they had someone working that night. And what shift was that called? Very good. And if they were saved, they would say, dead ringer's a boxer. What's the term? If the bell went off, saved by the bell. But that's not true either. That actually is boxing as well. You hit the bell. So we did bury people in the ground. I don't know if you're aware of this or not. After the 6 foot, there is actually in New York State no requirement, and as far as burial is concerned, and they only require 18 inches to 24 inches from the top of the grave in the state of New York. The city of New York is only 36 inches, just for information. So we actually don't know how deep people are buried here. I know when I was a grave digger, I maybe did 1 foot, 2 foot. The reason why they buried it down was, threefold. One, bodies decay. And so the smell you have to deal with. And so as a result of that, you want them buried as soon as you can. The other thing is that you had to be concerned particularly in the city, where there may be grave robbers, but there were two types of grave robbers that would go in and try to get any of the possessions that were put into the coffin casket. And then there was the other culprits, medical students. Yes, medical students. In 1788, there was the doctors' riot. People were upset that doctors were going in, medical students were going into graveyards and exhuming bodies so they can do they could practice their surgical skills on the body. When the local populace found out about it, there was a huge riot in the city of New York, resulting in 20 people being killed. Now the question I have is, do you think they used those bodies?
Thank you, Robert.
So we have to put pirateers in context. Again, I mentioned to you I was with the militia. I was under Captain Benajah Strong, who was also from Islip Hamlet, east of here. And he was also from Setauket, as well as the Thompsons were from Setauket, as well as William Floyd and Mastic Shirley area. But let's put it back 250 years ago. At that time, the British passed the intolerable acts, if you recall, the coercive acts, 5 acts which were reprehensible as far as the people of this country at that time, the colonies, felt. After the intolerable acts were passed, there was the Battle of Lexington and Concord and Bunker Hill, as you are aware. Subsequently, the British were chased out of Boston Harbor and they came to invade New York. They wanted to be in New York, and so the Islip militia was called up in August of 1776, and we joined up with the Suffolk militia, and we went to the Battle of Long Island with Washington's troops from Manhattan into Brooklyn. Unfortunately, the Suffolk militia and the Islip militia was surrounded, and our General Nathaniel Woodhull was wounded and subsequently died, and our unit was disbanded and we had to go home. It is that time that Suffolk County became an occupied people. We were occupied for nearly 8 years. And during that period, on 2 occasions in 1776 and 1778, the king's men would go out and they would have any politician or male between the ages of 16 and 60 swear an oath of allegiance to the crown. Well, there was a concern that if you didn't swear, you were in trouble to the crown. You could be fined, you could be involved in forced labor, you could be enrolled in the British Army, you could be half hung like Squire Brewster. You know what half hang means? It's a torture technique. It's like waterboarding in 1776, where they attempt to hang you, but they don't really mean it. They're trying to use it as an interrogation technique. Other things, people would get whipped, and so as a result of that, a significant number of people who had positions, like Mr. Havens, Captain Havens, who was a pirateer, but also part of the New York State Provincial Congress government, and as a result of that, the British officers were looking for them. In fact, on this property, you already know, there were Hessian troops, there were Queen's Rangers, and Sir Henry Clinton with British troops. But South Shore was not that populated with British troops. It was more the North Shore, because they were concerned of our trade with Connecticut, going back and forth across Long Island Sound, the Devil's Belt, it was called. During this time period, and if you look at the island, it was Kings, Queens, and Suffolk County. There are relatively few people that were few rebels who became refugees to either Connecticut or upstate New York, and twice as many of the few in Queens that decided to do this thing. There were 5,000 rebels and their families who evacuated to Connecticut. But while they were in Connecticut, they decided that we'd get involved in some activities, because a lot of them were in the shipping industry, the fishing industry, and so they used their yawls, their schooners, their sloops, or whatever boats they had, and they became either whaleboat warriors or they became privateers, as that young man noted. Now the whaleboat warriors, for instance, Captain Benage de Strong, were involved in raids of the Manor of St. George and Mastic Shirley area, as well as at Setauket. And they also were involved in raids to get prisoners for prisoner exchange, and getting, I say as well a lot. They also were getting a number of goods from refugee families that they couldn't get to, so they would actually clean out their house to give them money where they had it hidden, or food, or things along those lines. The privateers. Now the privateers was a separate group entirely. The ultimate patriots and capitalists. They would arm their boats and they would get a license from the provincial New York government or the Connecticut government to essentially act on behalf of the provincial governments or the continental cause, the patriotic cause, to plunder and capture British merchant ships or other merchant ships that were hostile to the patriotic cause. And they went out and they would get, essentially, the crew and the captain would share in the booty that was taken from those boats. Initially, both the provincial governments wanted a third, but they found out that when they reduced it to 10% or so, they actually got more money, believe that or not. So they were very effective politically, they were very effective economically. In fact, they were so effective that the Continental Navy was upset and wrote to Congress saying, you've got to stop these recruitment efforts by privateers. They're getting more of our sailors than we can bring into the Navy.
Are any of you familiar with the Victorian era and some of the symbolism here that we see surrounding us in this very cemetery? I think I need to call on my dear friend Robert to explain once again.
Yes, the cemetery, the family plot here is very, very unique in the sense that if you look around, you see this beautiful heavy gauge wrought iron fence. Probably came around 1860. The first person buried here, Jonathan will point out, is his mother, actually, Mary Gardner Thompson, and you can see it's a brownstone marker. It's a sedimentary rock, which if water gets behind it, it freezes and it starts popping. We replaced it with a granite stone, an igneous stone, and so you can see that it's significantly better. But if you look at all of these markers, they are from the Georgian period. Again, sedimentary rocks, and you can see even here his second wife, we had to replace Sarah Bratner's stone with a granite stone. One of the things you'll notice when you look at a graveyard, you know, maybe you want to stand up in the back. Okay, don't stand up. You'll notice all of the text for the gravestone is on the west side, yet the bodies are buried on the west side. Why would that be? Why would you bury the stones on the west side? Again, they're Presbyterians primarily, Protestants. They believed in Christ. So what happens then from the east every day? The sun rises. And who else rises? Who may rise? Christ may rise, the resurrection. And so that's why they're buried that way, east to west. You'll also notice that this is a sarcophagus. While it's not Victorian, Junus is actually, I believe, his coffin is buried in here. I believe that's the case. If you look across the back, you'll see the center area is Squire Isaac Thompson, his wife Mary Gardner Thompson, and his second wife. His daughter Mary is buried there, and Mary Howell. And Mary's two sons, Mary Gardner, is Jonathan and Abraham Gardner Thompson. That's the Abraham Gardner section of the property. The center section of the property is Isaac Thompson and his two wives. And this section is Jonathan Thompson, his wife Elizabeth, and Eunice, and I just found out today Henry, who was stillborn.
No, he lived a few months.
Oh, okay, sorry. Is buried here, although it's an unmarked grave. Now, the Victorian era was really known for its opulence, its symbolism. For instance, if you look at the two boys, Jonathan and Abraham Gardner Thompson, they're really buried as if they were in a bed. And on the outside, you have engravings, one, and both actually indicating the reputation of each. Jonathan being a merchant and a public official, sorry, and the other one being a merchant. Again, the symbolism of the wreath was of victory over death, although I guess not in either of those two cases. Elizabeth has an urn with an overflowing cloth. That's a life well lived, a very fruitful life.
11 kids and 95 years of age. I think
Yes.
she did a pretty good job.
Other symbols you'll see, for instance, in the back you see smaller headstones for the children. In the Victorian era you may see a lamb on top of a headstone, signifying or a cradle, or a bed, a very small bed with a headstone. That would be for a child. An obelisk was for eternity. And if it was broken, a broken obelisk, it was to reflect a life taken too early. The other thing I wanted to mention to you is Victorian memorial traditions. If Elizabeth, you can come this way.
Yes.
The Victorian memorial traditions followed Queen Victoria and her suffering after the death of her loved husband Albert. And so it would not be unusual for a woman to be dressed like this for a period of 3 years. In fact, they said Victoria wore black her entire life. In this particular case, you have not only a bonnet, but you have a veil over the top. They called this widow weed, and it would matched with black gloves and heavy clothing with crepe. Now the husband, Jonathan, he would wear a hat with black, and then on an arm he would wear a black crepe. Women bore the heaviest burden of the memorial ritual, where she would wear this for 3 years, yet Jonathan would only have to wear the armband for a period of 1 year. Eventually the rules lessened, and they had full mourning, which was 1 year of this outfit, and 1 year of half mourning. Now half mourning, you had the pleasure of changing from black to gray or lavender, or a combination. Isn't that great? Now if it was a child, the parents could mourn for as long as they saw fit, and in the case of Victoria, she mourned her entire life with the loss of Albert. If it was a cousin or a nephew or an uncle, generally it was 6 months. The other things that they did in that period of time, they would cut locks of hair, and they would make the hair into jewelry, rings, lockets, brooches, or they would make a wreath to be put in the house and hang it in the house. All of the pictures of the deceased would be placed down. I think that's superstition. The mirrors would all be covered with cloth. The curtains were closed because they didn't want anyone to get their reflection in the dead person's house, because that would be bad luck. You'd stop the clock at the time of death, and I think I've covered it.
Thank you, Robert.